Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the final week of our series, Beyond Yourself. Now, throughout it, we've been looking at how despite our culture telling us that our happiness lies in the center of a self-concerned, self-absorbed, self-accumulating life, Jesus counters it and teaches that life is so much bigger and more beautiful when you think and live beyond yourself. What we see from the very beginning was that God's plan, God's strategy, God's blueprint all the way back in Genesis 12 was to start a new tribe, a new way of living that would bring God's blessing to the entire world. In Genesis 12, God speaks to Abram and essentially says, I'm going to bless you so that you can go and be a blessing. I want all nations and people groups to know me, to be in relationship with me, to live under my righteous rule and reign, to know my love and leadership. And this idea, this theme is repeated all throughout the scriptures. This is the backdrop to every page in your Bible, and it culminates in the life of Jesus. The gospel accounts, which detail Jesus' life and teachings, give us numerous examples of how Jesus expanded his kingdom by blessing the people he encountered. Here at Lake Point, we are convinced that we've been blessed to be a blessing. And so we want to look to Jesus to figure out how to live that out. 3 years ago, we did a 6-week series on Bless, and we shared at the time that this wasn't just a one and done series, that this really was the way forward for our church family. Bless is an acronym we use to remember the 5 practices that Jesus modeled for us when it comes to blessing others. So the first letter in that acronym is B, and it stands for Begin with Prayer, which probably sounds predictable coming from a pastor, but this really is the foundation. This is so important because prayer was central to Jesus' ministry. In Luke 4, we read how Jesus was led by the Spirit in the wilderness where he fasted and prayed for 40 days. 2 chapters later, when Jesus was getting ready to select those who would join him on his mission, we read the following in Luke chapter 6, verse 12, that Jesus went up on a mountain to pray and he prayed to God all night. If we want to be a blessing, it begins with prayer. Now, if you're like me and you grew up in a Christian home and have been part of a church community most of your life, I'm assuming you've had numerous people praying with you and for you and about you. But the reality is this, there are people you come across every day who have never once had someone pray for them. But God has placed them across your path. And so when you pray, you ask God who he has placed in your life that he wants to use you to bless. You pray and you ask God for opportunities to build or strengthen your relationship with the people he has put in your path. And you pray and you ask God to grant wisdom, courage, discernment, whatever you need in order to best love and serve those people. If we're going to bless our community, it begins with prayer. And then once praying for people becomes a regular occurrence in your life, you start practicing the second thing that Jesus demonstrated so well. You start listening. It's something that sounds seemingly simple, but alas, it's something so few of us actually do. David Augsburger, he writes these profound words. He says, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. If we want to love our neighbors, our co-workers, our family and friends into the kingdom, if we want to be a blessing, we need to become intentional about listening. Jesus was an amazing listener. And as a great listener, Jesus asked great questions. Upon studying the Gospels, we see that Jesus seems to have lived his life in such a way that he didn't assume he knew what other people needed. And I think he would want us to do the same. Jesus wants us to resist the trap of assumption. And so he modeled for us what it looks like to ask questions and then to genuinely listen to the answers. One of the amazing things about Jesus is he is totally engaged with everyone he meets. He is completely mindful of them, their lives, their interests, their joys, and their sufferings. And that kind of attention, that kind of presence, that kind of listening changes the world. Because when we offer that to another human being, we change their world. Listening is an act of love. So we've got prayer, we've got listening, and the next practice of Jesus we're meant to replicate in order to be a blessing to those around us is to eat. That's right, in order to be a blessing, we're meant to eat with other people. Listening and eating, they go hand in hand. It's why people on first dates usually go out to dinner. Much of Jesus' ministry centered around meals. I mean, think about it. He performed his first miracle at a wedding feast. One of his most well-known miracles was feeding the 5,000 on a hill in the countryside. The night before his crucifixion, he brought his close friends together for a meal. And after his resurrection, he shared breakfast on the beach with his disciples. In the book of Luke alone, there are 10 stories of Jesus dining with various people. In fact, we probably wouldn't have the Gospel of Matthew if Jesus had never invited him to a meal. Back in first century Middle Eastern culture, eating was a statement of association. To eat with someone was to affirm that person's value, dignity, and worth. Who you ate with indicated who you loved and who you considered to be a part of your social class. It's why religious leaders never ate with sinners. That would be unacceptable in their society. Yet time and time again, we see just not only eating with Matthew, a tax collector, but a bunch of other social outcasts. It's a powerful example for us to actually emulate. You see, the New Testament writers, they place an enormous value on hospitality. The Apostle Paul, he writes, always be eager to practice hospitality. Now, when we hear the word hospitality, we instinctively think of maybe a perfectly tidy house or beautiful decorations or delicious meal, but here's what you need to appreciate. In biblical times, the emphasis was not on the food, but on the company. It was welcoming the stranger into your life and making them feel loved. The ironic part about the E in bless is that it has nothing to do with what you eat. It's all about who you're eating with. We need to be willing to share a meal with anyone and everyone. All right, next up, let's talk about the first of the two S's in the word bless, serve. As we explore throughout this series, we all have this tendency to believe that the good life or the blessed life is when other people serve our needs and desires. And that's what makes Jesus so special. I mean, he came and showed us a better way, a life of service where we lay down our crown and we pick up a towel. The night before his crucifixion, Jesus shared in a very intimate meal with his disciples, and before the meal began, John tells us that Jesus got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. Now, in the ancient world, washing someone's feet was a common practice before sharing a meal. Yet, it was a job reserved for the lowest ranking person in the house, typically a servant. Why? Because it was a nasty job. In the first century, feet were one of the dirtiest parts of your body. I mean, just imagine, no nail clippers, no pedicures, no socks, and a culture that embraced sandals year-round. What's more, this was an honor and shame culture. Protecting your reputation and your dignity was critically important. Your honor was like your credit rating. The higher your honor score, the more privilege and prestige you enjoyed. If you had a high honor score, other people were expected to serve you. Washing feet in public would be a great way to tank your honor score. No one would risk that. It's why Peter protests so heavily when Jesus goes to wash his feet. Peter's like, over my dead body. And yet Jesus is like, actually, over mine. And when he's finished, Jesus says this to his disciples. He says, for I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. What we see here is that Jesus wasn't just performing a kind goodbye gesture to his disciples on the night before his crucifixion. Rather, it was meant to catalyze a movement, a new way of thinking and living, and not just for them, but for us as well. Like the disciples, we live in a world that believes that the higher up you rise and the more power you accumulate and wealth you accumulate, the more blessed you will become and the more leverage you will possess to get other people to serve you. But Jesus turns that paradigm on its head and he says, here's what it looks like to truly live a blessed life. He says, you serve. Well, friends, you can't spell blessed with only one S, and the reality is you won't likely help anyone discover the love of God without eventually using your words and your story. Sharing your story is not just about memorizing scripture, it's about communicating impact. In John chapter 9, we read about an interaction Jesus had with a man who had been blind from birth. After being healed by Jesus, the blind man tells practically everyone he encounters, and this is what he shares. He says, I was blind. This is who I was before I met Jesus. He put mud on my eyes. This is how I encountered Jesus, and now I see. This is the difference that Jesus has made in my life. It's a clear, concise, and compelling story. And it gives us a great framework for telling our own story. Part 1, my life before Jesus. Part 2, how I met Jesus. Part 3, my life after I met Jesus. Here's the reality. Each of us has a story to share, and each of us needs to work at telling our story well. You see, we've been blessed to be a blessing, and so we need to follow the example of our King. We need to pray for the people God has placed around us. We need to get to know them through sharing meals with them and listening to them and asking good questions. And as we do, we discover their story and identify ways to actually serve them. And eventually, through consistent Christ-like behavior and love, we earn the right to share the good news of Jesus and the good news of what he's done in our lives. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next time.